the project, it would be helpful to highlight why we would begin with India. And then the second question, of course, is what are some of our key findings? And what does that tell us about how globalization impacts the legal profession, and how it impacts India, and how India's changes are impacting the world? Now, I'm going to begin with why India. Now, to an audience here, it seems like that would be an almost obvious question. But I'm going to follow the old adage that ghar ki murgi dal barabar, which essentially means the chicken at home is just treated as dal. We sometimes don't understand what makes our country so special, not just to ourselves, but even outside. So why India? The standard response is it's a very large country with a huge population and a great deal of resources, both of which are true. But I think that really just scratches the surface as to why India is actually important. What I like to refer to as the 4 Ds of India. First, India is a country that is striving for development. And of course, legal and policy change is instrumental to that, whether that's opening up the market to foreign direct investment or to any other kind of restrictions that are in place. Of course, legal change is central to that. Second, India is a democracy, indeed the largest democracy. The reason that's significant is whenever you engage in development efforts, you will create winners and relative losers. And of course, in a democracy, relative losers vote, which puts something of an immediate constraint on the urgency of the development efforts. They vote against changes that they fear hurt their interests. And that makes politicians a little bit more cautious in deciding how far they want to push on the development agenda. Third, India's diversity. India is easily the most diverse country in the world, with countless languages, 23 of which are considered official, many different religions, and all kinds of regional diversity. It makes obtaining consensus for legal reform and policy change all that more difficult, because you already have various perceived and real fissures in society that require people to come to consensus. That again tends to slow down the process of doing legal change for development. Fourth, India's demography. As many of you know, India has a population that is getting younger every year, but also just in sheer size is massive. You have, roughly speaking, 750 million people below the age of 40. And everyone talks about the demographic dividend. And of course, that's very much a real possibility. But if those 750 million don't get jobs, that demographic dividend turns into a demographic disaster. That puts an urgency to the development efforts. If you really want to create employment of that scale, you need to move development along with urgency. But as I've just mentioned, the 2 Ds prior to this, democracy and diversity, actually tend to slow down the urgency for development by requiring more negotiation, more consensus building. That makes studying India actually central and critical, not just for understanding India's fate, but for understanding how the world will respond to globalization. And of course, the law plays a critical role in negotiating this. It's the law that works as the grist, as all of these 4 Ds sort of work against each other, sometimes with each other, to allow it to happen. The law is both the negotiating influence, the outcome, and the mediator in this process. And of course, that means the legal profession is critical. Legal change is not simply about changing the words in a book or in a statute. It's about making that a reality. And that's what the legal profession does in spades. We turn the written law into reality. That makes studying the legal profession absolutely critical. And more specifically, in the Indian context, when you think about what the law does in India and what the legal profession does, those 4 Ds are present in varying degrees in all different parts of the world, which makes understanding how India responds to it an instructive lesson with many insights for those looking for how globalization is going to impact both their countries, but also the legal profession therein. All right, well, without too much further ado, I thought we would begin talking about what are some of our key findings and what insights do they provide to us. I thought I'd group this into 4 different buckets, starting with the one that might be nearest and dearest to our own hearts, the impact on India's legal profession. It is transitioning, but many local elements remain, as Professor Wilkins was mentioning. We do see the growth of in-house departments, of large corporate law firms, and of the corporate sector more generally in India. But we also still see many attributes of the local environments in India. strong kinship networks, family ties, and even the division amongst attorneys, those in the litigating bar, those in the super litigating bar, such as the senior advocates. Those divisions, or those sorts of gradations, continue even till today. Now that leads a lot of people to think, well, maybe India's not changing. And I would suggest to you that that's sort of misreading what's happening. Change doesn't occur overnight. Even when I change my clothes, I take some amount of time. So when you're thinking about changing an entire structure of the legal profession, that's not going to happen overnight. But it does lead for some interesting thoughts to puzzle about. So for example, many commentators on business in India often wonder, why is it so dominated by family enterprise? And one typical response to that is, given the weak contract enforcement mechanisms in India, family serves as a way to bond your agreements so that people believe they will happen. You deal with a reputable family, and you would expect the contract to actually be adhered to. You deal with someone who doesn't have that reputation, then all bets are off the table in some ways. In that context, it makes sense that people rely upon family or other kinds of norms of getting things done. What's so fascinating about the legal profession in India is, if the reason for relying so much on family is in part weak contract enforcement, changes in the legal system and in law firms would be the place you'd look to see whether contract enforcement might actually begin to move you away from family business. And what we're seeing in India is a move away in some steps, which indicates at least that the overall picture of prognosis for family business in India is a good thing. We may continue to see family business in some industries where it's both valuable and culturally important, but it does suggest that in the Indian context, even in something like the law firm context, we're beginning to see moving away from it. The other thing that's probably worth noting, and one that I think everyone is familiar with in this room, is what I call unleashing the power of jugaad. Now, to most people in India, we all know what that means. That's essentially the ability to improvise a situation to make something work just once. It doesn't have to be a system that will, persist over the long term. It just needs to work for today. That ability to improvise with tremendous flexibility is actually something you see in many parts of the Indian economy, but also in many parts of the Indian legal profession. In the book, we have a number of different areas where we see that playing out, whether it's in how the mortgage market develops in India, which is the result of a certain kind of a jugaad that general counsels of banks were able to engage in, relying upon the ever so infamous Section 138 of the Negotiable Instruments Act, or whether it's in the recruitment of law students to law firms, where there are no placement offices. The students themselves organize structures that help them to get jobs in law firms and in other environments, something that you don't see anywhere else in the world. If I were going to describe this to a US audience, they might respond by saying, you're letting the inmates run the asylum. To which I would respond, no, they're very motivated inmates. They know exactly what they're doing in the asylum, right? And of course, there are also other areas in which you see the jugaad. In a superb paper by one of our contributors, Professor Pavan Mamadi, there's a discussion of how small-town lawyers have been able to overcome some of the fragmentation in India's property markets to arrange for the ability of large companies to buy large tracts of land. Now that jugaad, and what makes it so interesting, is it suggests an entrepreneurial spirit and also a flexibility in doing things that is actually exceptionally valuable in the global space. When one thinks about where the legal profession is going in the world, typically you're moving towards integrated business solutions, which require nimbleness and agility in the people who are involved in it. I would venture a guess that there are very few lawyers around the world who have the combination of agility, nimbleness, and talent that you see in the Indian legal profession. I don't know any other place where I could see people who are incredibly knowledgeable about corporate and business matters, but are able to turn on a dime to get things done. It is actually quite remarkable to behold, and I think places the Indian corporate legal sector in a much superior position than perhaps some other places around the world. Of course, once we've talked about India's legal profession, we should talk about the global legal profession too. Now, of course, as Professor Wilkins mentioned, the outsourcing movement has been a very significant impact that India has had on the global legal market. And that's really led to the growth of a global supply chain for legal services and for the outsourcing of legal work. Now, typically, most commentary on this is very sort of downtrodden. It is essentially that, oh my goodness, look at the back office work that is being sent to India. This is costing jobs in the US or the UK. I would suggest to you that these effects are largely transitory in some ways, because when you reduce the price of legal services, like with most things, you tend to increase the demand for those services. So to the extent that jobs disappear because some of it's being shipped to India, the reduction in price actually leads to more people demanding legal services, which creates the offsetting effect. But I would suggest to you that the employment effects are actually very small in net terms. The bigger effects are actually on the architecture of law practice. To the extent that people remained in very, very large law firms because they wanted to be able to rely on the back office, they don't need to do that anymore. They can push the back office out so that they can focus on what they're most interested in doing. So nowadays in New York, you will actually see groups of very talented litigators that openly advertise that they outsource most of the work. They only specialize in arguing matters in court. It allows them to specialize, which actually enhances their efficiency and their value to their clients. If you look at outsourcing that way, the effect is actually one that changes the architecture of law practice and the competitive structure for how law services are being provided. That is one small impact that India is having on the legal services market globally. Of course, the nimbleness and the agility that we're talking about that arise from the jugaad, or the ability to do it, is yet another. As more and more people from India end up doing things in the global space, they're interacting in areas where the ground is usually shifting. Many countries keep changing their legal policy and their regimes on a regular basis. I would venture a guess that Indian attorneys are better at dealing with that shifting landscape in a quick frame than perhaps almost anybody out there. All right, two more categories I want to talk about. One is, of course, the impact on the global economy of India's legal profession's rise. Now, there are many different ways in which one could sort of slice this particular onion. What I would suggest to you is that the legal profession's role in regulating business, both in India and in the future elsewhere, is larger than one might think. And I'll give you a simple example of how that might play out. Everyone in this room is, of course, familiar with the important Supreme Court decision on privacy, right? The amazing 547-page tome that describes that India has a constitutional right to data privacy, Indian citizens do, and what that might mean for Aadhaar. But of course, when you think about what the court actually says, it gives every citizen in India a right to privacy, data privacy, the boundaries of which are not yet fully defined, understandably so, because technology is developing as we speak. But it also subjects private business to those same kinds of constraints, which means all the Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world, all the tech-based companies are going to have to now think, what do we do about addressing the data privacy issues raised in the largest market for social media in the world, right? One decision by India's Supreme Court has had more commentary on it outside of India than perhaps any single decision of the Indian Supreme Court since independence. I myself counted over 70 different major news articles dealing with the privacy decision with fairly in-depth analysis, suggesting that even some of the changes we see in India's legal order have reverberations that hit economies not just here, but globally. Finally, I don't want to leave the topic without talking about going forward, because I always like to think about the future. So, going forward, the impact on India's polity of the changes we're seeing in India's legal profession. So as I mentioned before, if you're really serious about development and change, it's not enough to change the words in a statute book, right? You need to change the ground reality. The legal profession is the ground reality. So whatever we're seeing in the legal profession in terms of change, that will also impact the effect of law reform on India. Whatever kinds of changes we're trying to bring about through our economic and policy reforms will not occur the way we anticipate unless we interact and understand how the legal profession both itself responds to this and how it is responding to the globalization that it is facing. Right? Now, that of course assumes that the only thing that lawyers in India do is respond to change. That's unfair. Lawyers in India increasingly play a central role in what the written law in the statute books is. Now, of course, lawyers have always played that role. because most of the parliamentarians typically have a legal background. But this is even more direct in the sense that law firms, in-house counsels, and others are more actively involved in the process of lobbying for legal change. That has at least two major effects. One, that when they actually do the lobbying, they are thinking about both their own interests, obviously, but also those of their client, and those are getting represented in their interactions with the government and those drafting the various laws. The second thing, of course, that the lobbying does is it suggests that the legal order is becoming more formal, because there's no point in lobbying and spending resources on law if you don't think that it matters. Whereas in the past, the perception was that it didn't make so much difference what the law was because connections and other things mattered more. The fact that law firms and others are getting more active in the lobbying space is actually a good sign for the rule of law, although perhaps in a somewhat unpredictable way. All right, and finally, of course, as the economy in India develops, we're going to see a changing role of the state. We all talk about deregulation, but in fact, what we're witnessing is deregulation coupled with re-regulation. In that space, the legal profession, of course, takes a leading role, both in understanding how regulators interact, but also what the underlying regulations should be, because they're on the ground understanding how the various rules affect the incentives of the players. Getting the legal profession involved in this aspect more is critical to the ability to actually do the re-regulation that is necessary as the Indian economy becomes more globalized, less limited by the prior sort of structures of command and control economies, and more driven towards a contract-oriented, somewhat more market-oriented structure, where lawyers and their ability to do transactions, to contract, and to represent their clients becomes central to the ability of the state to function in that new environment. That is both critical for India, but also for India's role in the global economy. With that, I'll hand back the floor to Professor Wilkins and to our fantastic panel that can discuss some of these findings and illuminate our understanding further. Thank you so much.